Yeah, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. You're welcome to this session. Thank you. This session is about climate finance, and this is the glue that holds together everything that will be discussed at this COP. Without money, it will just be talk. It's money that will enable the actions to take place. But let me ask a question. How many of us know that Africa, that 9 of the 10 most vulnerable countries to climate change are in Africa? How many of us know? Thank you, sir. Can you name 1 or 2 of them? You know it's about 9. The Sahel, all those countries. Thank you. You're right. And how many of us know how much Africa needs to address its vulnerability between now, 2020, and 2030? You don't. 4 trillion. Next, who else? How much do we need to address our climate change issues between 2020 and 2030? Okay. I'll leave you to that. Pardon? 3.5 billion. Very good. I wish we were all the leaders of the world to make such monies available. But don't worry. By the end of this session, you're going to have answers to that. So this session is basically about ramping up adaptation finance. Africa is very vulnerable, and we don't have sufficient resources to address that vulnerability. So, without wasting time, I'm going to invite the chief economist of the African Development Bank, who also is the vice president for economic governance and knowledge management, Professor Kevin Orama. He will tell us, he knows everything. He'll tell us about that, what we need to know about climate change finance for adaptation, what we need to know, how it should flow, and where it should flow to. You have the floor, sir.
Could you put up the presentation, please? Could you please put on the presentation? Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. So today we are going to be spending about 10 minutes to rush through the findings of several reports that the African Development Bank Group has done on the issues about mobilizing private sector financing for climate and green growth in Africa, covering also issues around climate adaptation and mitigation. These reports are available on our website. 10 minutes is just not enough for us to answer all the questions that Tony is asking, but we'll try to answer a few of them and hopefully encourage you to go read the reports. One of them is called the African Economic Outlook Report for 2023. Then the other one is the same report, but at the regional level, the Regional Economic Outlook Reports for all the 5 regions of the continent. And then we have country-focused reports for each country, answering all the questions that we've all been asking in terms of how much do we need, how much are we getting, how much is the gap that we need, and what are the sources where we can actually get those financing flows to happen. So here is the outline of my presentation. I'm not going to spend time much about it. We'll talk about inclusive growth and green growth development in Africa. We'll look at Africa's NDC's financing gap, addressing those questions, and then also how the private sector is performing in trying to fill that gap. Quite often, we hear, oh, we need to leverage the private sector. We hear issues around innovative climate finance options. How are we doing as a continent in attracting those? So first point here is to say that inclusive growth and green growth is actually good for economic development on the continent. What we found in the report was that there's a very high correlation between countries that are implementing inclusive and green growth policies and also economic and climate resilience, mapping almost perfectly, telling us that the old thinking around, oh, if you do climate and green growth, then you are not going to be able to grow is not true. And this is from Africa, not from other countries. But also we find that countries who are doing better in green growth are also doing better in meeting other economic development needs. So we conclude in that report that pursuing green growth objectives yields immense economic and climate benefits. And one of the benefits that we get from that as a continent is that this continent is already, as we speak, losing 5 to 15% of its GDP per capita growth, translating to 7 to 15 billion US dollars annually because of climate impacts. So when we address climate change, we stop ourselves from losing that huge source of resources that we've been talking about there. But then the continent has huge opportunities for driving and actually leading the green transitions that we are all talking about. First, Africa is a market size that is growing so fast, and trillions of dollars now on the continent. And then the human capital we have on this continent, 1.4 billion people today, but soon to become 2.5 billion by 2040, 2050. And we have significant natural assets that just makes us, as the continent, the place to be, whether you are an investor interested in green transition or you are a citizen that will want green transition to happen. For example, I just give one. Everybody talks about renewable energy. This continent holds about 45% of global technical potential in renewable energy. And if you talk about green transitions, other green minerals for electric vehicles and so on, one country in Africa alone has about 51% of the global deposits of cobalt, and that is DR Congo. And we have several of such things. If you look at nickel, platinum, all those things, name it, most African countries have huge deposits of that. So how we relate with that will help us to be able to make that opportunity and mobilize resources internally for addressing our green transitions, even without looking at the external flows, which needs to come as well. Green technology potential, I've already mentioned the case of renewable energy, but we also have very limited lock-in infrastructure. So it is a lot easier for us to be able to do the green development program and so on. And we have high political will for green transition on the continent. Here is just to whet our appetite for investors who might be listening. In Africa's agriculture, climate-smart agriculture is worth almost $1 trillion in Africa by 2030. And it's the same in energy, almost 1.03 trillion US dollars by 2020. And also, when you think about ICT, digitization, and so on, we're estimating that as green transition takes root, ICT and digitization will grow very fast in terms of the dollar values of that market, as well as also in the transport and electric vehicles, which has been estimated now to be about 8 trillion US dollars by 2030. But one big challenge is what Tony was saying, financing. Climate financing is shortchanging all these opportunities that we have been talking about on the continent. And one of the reasons is because the architecture of the climate financing is misaligned with climate vulnerability and the needs for climate financing. So if you look at the structure, it's so complicated that it's very difficult for countries that don't have capacity to be able to prepare projects to access that financing. And no wonder the flow of climate financing is also very much misaligned with climate vulnerability. The report finds that the more vulnerable you are as a country, the less likely you are to be able to access climate financing. So even on the continent, the countries that access climate financing, those paltry amounts we receive, are the ones that have built some level of capacity in institutions and ability to be able to prepare and access those projects. And because of that, the scale of financing is totally misaligned with climate, with the needs for climate for implementation even of the NDCs only. So one of the answers to the question Anthony was asking, if you look at this slide, you can see what happened. Okay. So if you look at this slide, you can see the needs we have for adaptation, the needs we have for mitigation, loss and damage, and other needs with regard to climate change, totaling about $2.7 trillion US dollars between now, 2022 and 2030. So that, if you look at what we are receiving as at 2019-2020, the continent was receiving just about 29.5 billion US dollars, received just about 29.5 billion US dollars, leaving a huge gap of 213 billion US dollars each year. Put this in perspective. We are in COP28. We have been discussing 100 billion for the whole developing countries. Africa alone needs 242.4 billion annually to implement the nationally determined contributions. And when you look at the performance of public and private sector financing, a lot of that financing is coming from the public sector. A lot of that in Africa is coming from the public sector. If you look at the graph by the left here, you'll find that only 14% of that 29.5 billion is coming from the private sector. And if you look at the leverage ratio on the continent is so low, just 0.16, compared to like 8.6 in several other countries, regions, and countries as well. And I've already mentioned that flow of financing is inversely related with climate vulnerability and needs. So that tells me that even if we succeed in getting the 100 billion, the vulnerable countries that actually need this climate financing will not receive them. So we need to think of rethinking the global climate finance architecture if we're serious about getting those financing to go to countries. And one of the most worrying part of it for me is that that 29.5 billion that I've talked about is only mostly debt instruments. 75% of that climate finance that comes to Africa are debt instruments. So countries who are already vulnerable to climate change are now being driven into debt vulnerability and higher cost of capital, and the spiral effect that this creates for poverty, for fragility, for climate vulnerability. So it's just a vicious cycle that never ends. So if you look there, you can see grants, very small, that is coming to Africa with this. And out of that 75% of debt, 33% of that are non-concessional debt. So the high-cost debt that countries have contracted in order to address adaptation and mitigation in their countries, deepening their vulnerabilities instead of helping to reduce that. And again, a lot of that resource goes to energy systems, buying solar panels, or rather importing solar panels onto the continent. And that, even at that, if you look at the needs, which we are going to hear from the panelists, we are not meeting that need in the energy sector, even though a lot of that is going to the energy sector. But all the other things, cross-sectional issues, building, agriculture, forestry, land use, wastewater management, industry, and all the things that Africa really needs to build adaptation capacity, they are not receiving funding because the current financial architecture is biased towards mitigation as well. So, but if you look at it, Africa is not fully leveraging the expanding global private sector landscape and green finance landscape. If you look at this figure, you will find that Africa is almost at the bottom. And when people try to convince us that because of innovative financing mechanisms we are going to address climate change in Africa, I say, please wait a minute. Because if you look at cumulative green bonds, Africa has only accessed 0.2% of the global cumulative green bonds. So those instruments benefit countries that have the capacity to access financing, because the current structure, financing only flows to where there is already financing. You need a minimum stock of capital to be able to attract capital. And global carbon markets, already also, when you look at that, Africa has only accessed 6.2% of that. Africa is doing a little bit better in blended financing, which we account for about 41% of the global share. Now, what are the enablers of climate financing that Africa needs to focus on? One, public climate finance per capita. The more financing you have from the public sector dedicated to climate financing and leveraging private sector, then you get more private sector financing. So countries that doesn't have that capital is very unlikely to leverage that financing. Countries that have grown their gross national income also more likely to receive climate financing. And this is why I've always argued that in Africa, addressing climate change means addressing poverty alleviation, growing the incomes of countries so that we have the capacity to even participate in the whole discussions and receiving funding. The other one that has positive effect is quality of infrastructure in countries. Again, investing in infrastructure, green infrastructure, is a great way of building adaptation capacity and resilience of countries. And again, quality of public institutions. Now, for us to be able to look at that, I say the issue here in this graph is to stress that we don't have to divulge financing, education, infrastructure, roads, and all the other things from climate adaptation and so on. We know there are always many challenges. We don't have strategies and implementation effectiveness in many African countries that needs to be built, weak regulatory structures and institutions, lack of investment-ready projects, limited access to international markets. I won't spend so much time on that. But briefly on this, because we are talking about private sector, a lot of the global private sector, our reports find, have limited experience on the continent, so they read magazines and watch television, and they think the whole of Africa is too risky, and because of that, there's a disincentive for financing projects in Africa. So this information asymmetry leads to a high perceived risk on the continent, and that drives away capital from the continent. And then that again leads to poor risk ratings that makes the cost of capital high so that countries cannot accept that capital. But again, the report finds again that that assessment, which is the current thing, we have this risk premium on the continent, is ill-perceived. Because when you look at the default rates of infrastructure and other projects in Africa, Africa is the lowest in the world. And so Tony is standing, so I have to move very fast on this. So what are the policy recommendations that we need to look at? Countries must do their part. Develop long-term strategies for implementation roadmaps for greening your economy. And then that becomes a launch pad for investors to be able to come in. But we need appropriate fiscal reforms, implementing strategic industrial policies, boosting domestic revenue mobilization, and so on and so forth. But just a minute on this one. Multilateral development banks and the other development finance institutions need to expand concessional financing greatly if we are going to be able to make any dent on addressing climate adaptation on the continent. So we need to focus on providing more risk-agnostic catalytic instruments like partial risk guarantees. And this is why you are going to hear from the bank later the instruments the bank is developing, like the climate action window, in order to help expand this concessional financing in Africa. I'm not going to talk through all the things that needs to be done because Tony is already signaling time. But the private sector themselves, we also need to review our credit rating methodologies that is creating these inequalities within and the flow of capital in the world. And developing countries not only need to honor their commitments, but we need to try and estimate what actually is costing countries to be part of this climate discussion. So the 100 billion was arbitrary. We have not yet met it. You have just seen that Africa alone needs much more than that. We need to focus on data and evidence and not just political decisions here. In conclusion, let's try and establish our national development plans for green transition to help attract capital to specific issues and not just running after projects. Incentivize green industrialization to spur growth, provide guarantees at scale to de-risk the private sector investments, develop pipelines of bankable projects that will allow private sector to be able to invest. But the most important recommendation here is scaling low-cost concessional financing. And in the panel, will talk to us about the climate action window and other instruments that the bank has developed in order to help Africa to address this. In conclusion, please read these reports. You will find them outside, and then you'll be able to get more details. When you have a very strict, non-adaptive moderator like Tony Young, you must obey. Thank you so much.
Please, that wasn't good enough. What you have just heard here is powerful. But what are the few things you've taken on here? The role of the private sector, extremely very important. But who is our private sector? The SMEs. How do we reach and make provisions for them? Secondly, what I've also heard, which has really made me or pleased me, is that Africa is not just about gloom and doom. There are opportunities. But when you open any book, anything on climate change in Africa, the first thing you see is the vulnerability, the risk, the everything. That drives away that private sector we're talking about, because the private sector capital is not bold. It comes out, it creeps gently like a snailhead and watches how things are. And if all it hears is the doom, the gloom, the whatever, it tucks in and goes to where there is peace. So let's change our narrative. Africa deserves better. The money is important. We will get the money, but we should not own the intellectual property right for most vulnerable, for most affected, and so on. And then, thirdly, a lot of that money is going to finance mitigation. And we're low players in mitigation, so we lose out in the mitigation and then lose out in the adaptation, because what goes to adaptation is like 3%, mitigation about 97%. But having said that, some of our partners are very sensitive to this. And at COP26, these partners pledged to double the adaptation finance by 2025, which is commendable. So please, join me as I welcome Mr. Chris Bold, who is the head of International Financial Institutions Department at the FCDO, who will join us here to talk about what FCDO is doing, or the UK government is doing on adaptation. Please. Okay. And to join him is also, we have Mr. Peter Copper, who is the team lead on climate adaptation at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. Is he here? Mr. Peter Copper? Maybe he's on his way. Then we also have Ms. Leah Kibe, who is the Director, Co-Funding and Partnerships and Head of Africa Office at the Children's Investment Fund. Many of you may not have heard of this, but it's one of the largest financiers of climate change in Africa. It's not just about children. Actually, we're all children, as far as they are concerned, because they put the money everywhere. So, Mr. Bold, what is your government doing to support adaptation in Africa? Yeah, you can speak from here. And you may also want to touch a little bit on what you've heard.
Well, thank you for the invitation to speak here today, and thank you for that very powerful presentation. I hope that my remarks will respond to a couple of the challenges that you laid out so clearly at the end, in particular on the need for increased concessional finance. So during the Africa Climate Summit in Kenya earlier this year, we heard about the impact of climate instability from some of Africa's most vulnerable countries, and how they saw the potential of the climate action window to make a marked difference in the development of their countries. The UK is a leading supporter of the most vulnerable countries in Africa. Just last month, the UK agreed to contribute a further £7.4 million to ADRIFI, the African Development Bank's Africa Disaster Risks Financing Trust Fund. That brings our total contribution to £20 million. And this year, we've been convening stakeholders at events inside and outside the UK with the objective of facilitating greater flows of adaptation finance through our humanitarian assistance in particular. The UK is proud to be the largest single contributor to the Climate Action Window. We've provided £200 million for adaptation projects. We believe this demonstrates our commitment to support the poorest countries in Africa and our commitment to the African Development Bank's broader mission. But much more can be done, provided that we have the support of additional partners. The Climate Action Window, we believe, provides a bespoke mechanism to respond to the particular climate challenges faced in Africa. Firstly, its structure provides an effective route for channeling state and non-state funding side by side without further fragmentation through the AfDB's proven systems, using their expertise and the partnerships that they already have across the African continent. Secondly, it prioritizes adaptation financing, with 75% of its funds allocated to adaptation and resilience. Furthermore, the Window's strong technical assistance offer will go far to support the most vulnerable, put forward strong bids for climate adaptation investments. We're delighted that the African Development Bank is launching its call for proposals for the Climate Action Window here in Dubai this week. We look forward to its publication at regional and national levels and hearing further details of how the technical assistance pot will provide additional backing for the poorest and most vulnerable countries to produce strong proposals for the Climate Action Window's pipeline. The UK is committed to standing alongside our regional partners in this endeavour, and thank you all for your commitment too, as we drive to address Africa's dire climate financing gap and to continue to transform the lives of millions of people on the continent of Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gold. A couple of things. We're beginning to see a large number of philanthropists into the climate change space. This is a welcome move. And so, madam, you have the floor. What do you think the philanthropists can bring to the table?
Wow. Thank you, Anthony, and your team. And really, thank you very much, Aruna, for setting up this stage. And hello, everybody. I think, so as Anthony has introduced, I'm with the Children's Investment Fund Foundation. And a couple of my private sector partners were asking, what is philanthropy doing in the room? Philanthropy is here to get you where private sector will not go to. Philanthropy is here to start the race. And I think even as we speak about blended finance, we have to start a journey of blending the partnerships, blending the finance, and blending the investments. And the reality of adaptation finance, even as it becomes more imperative for Africa, is it's very difficult to convince a valuation of an adaptation investment to the private sector. But the reality is those items that cannot be monetized, those items that pursue much more of social impact, that's a space that philanthropic capital would love to pursue. So definitely, as I mentioned, what does philanthropy bring and what do we do as a Children's Investment Fund Foundation? I think this is so timely because at Al-Wahala, the same conversation is happening about this global financing architecture. And even as I just reflect on the journey, I come from Kenya, CIF's regional office is based out of Kenya, and just reflecting from the wins we had at the Africa Climate Summit, what has philanthropy done in the adaptation space? We've managed to elevate Africa's conversations at speed and at scale. And those are levers that even as the private sector and DFIs and governments still pursue, we are really quick and we are big. The only part that I pursue the private capital and the public capital to do is to bring us into the conversations. So starting right from the partnerships, let's start with blending the conversations first and ideating. So we've definitely heard that Africa is urgently lacking the de-risking assets, as I've mentioned, and we are here to pursue an estimated, I think, about 1 trillion of dormant private capital. And what we are convinced about is that the private sector financing, when we look at the Afri-Exim's bank, they'll be more than happy to pursue sustainable development if at all the first journey is taken up by capital that is worth taking the risk. So that is the other value proposition that we have. So we indeed do have examples where philanthropic capital has walked this journey. And just to reference a few, I'm sure we all know of the Sustainable Capital Fund, which is a blend between the R20, the Green Climate Fund, and PEGSA's Capital. We also do have the Africa Green Infrastructure Alliance, which has the Bloomberg Philanthropies as well, seeding AfDB specifically. And for us as SAFE, I would mention our partnership with the Acumen Fund that's really focusing on agriculture. So just to mention and reference your examples here. So, but we come here with a couple of reflections because the need, as you've described, it's urgent. The conversation that you've presented, there's quite an evident gap. So what have we learned and what do we want to do differently even as we come to discuss on the adaptation window? I think there has to be much focus on the leverage. The gap and the bridge that we need to pursue, if we're really gonna get to the 2.7 trillion, we really have to optimize all assets in that conversation. So for philanthropic capital, we ask ourselves, have we optimized the leverage? Have we gotten the public finance that was not available from governments? Have we gotten the private sector actors? So we're willing to take the leverage conversation a notch higher. But we also agree that our capital has to be flexible and it has to be patient. So those are some of the levers that will give a greater value proposition to unlocking much more financing towards the adaptation conversation. I think also just to reference is that we have to acknowledge there's a capital stack. That capital stack starts right from grants all the way to economic returns. And we have to agree the position that philanthropic grants and philanthropic capital would really need to play. And we stay at that space so that we're able to unlock the next capital spaces. So that's the lens of flexibility, the lens of scale, the lens of speed, and the lens of clarity of unlocking more money is important even as we pursue this under the window. My number 2 point is, I was just sitting next to my brother from Afri-Exim. One thing we can never downplay is that as we keep blending this finance, the positive financial return cannot be shortchanged. Private capital will always ask about the returns as well. So, and we do appreciate that adaptation has unproven revenue models. It's quite difficult to value, etc. But in these spaces, this is where philanthropic capital and SIF, more specifically, has played roles of building technical assistance, building this pipeline, making it investable. And lastly, on the scale piece, one thing that we've learned as philanthropic capital, we've pursued transactions. It's a high time we pursued facilities because that way we're able to leverage much more and also optimize the administrative costs for each transaction. So we really look forward to seeing what the climate action window has and what as a facility can elevate the duplication of costs and conversations. So lastly, I guess my parting shot, Anthony, and to the entire global assets community here is let's continue considering philanthropy. Let's see how much more we can leverage from philanthropic capital. From the road to COP28 and from even the Africa Climate Summit, we are actively in this conversation. The question is, how will you leverage the most of each dollar that we invest? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Leah. So, thank you very much, Leah. Thank you very much, Chris. You can go back to your seats. One of the things that also came out from the presentation by Professor Rama is that present climate finance is non-aligned. It does not go to where the needs are. And so the African Development Bank takes cognizance of this and has established the climate action window that will address the climate challenges of Africa's 37 low-income countries, because these are the people that do not have the right access to climate finance. And like I said, at COP26, countries pledged to double their adaptation finance by 2025. But what we've heard from them has been, but where are the projects? We want to invest in adaptation. We don't have the projects. So the African Development Bank has again established what we call the Country Climate Adaptation Compacts, which basically brings down adaptation projects to investable units that donors, private sector players can see and finance. We've done that to cover about 8 countries. We're doing now for 7 more countries in partnership with the Global Center on Adaptation. So I invite the team, the technical team, to please play the video on the climate action window to give you a flavor of what it's all about. And while that is going on, let me correct. We are launching it today. I know you are right.
By mankind, magnified by location. Climate change and its impacts are disproportionately affecting the African continent. Extreme climate events, intensified by global warming, are standing in the way of sustainable development in Africa, particularly among highly vulnerable low-income countries, which have contributed least to greenhouse gas emissions. While these countries need to adapt rather than mitigate climate change, adaptation investments are on a short timeline. The longer they take, the greater the cost. These investments are estimated to cost $2.8 trillion over the 2020 to 2030 period. However, Africa's access to global climate finance remains drastically low at only 3%. Africa urgently needs greater access to international climate finance to support adaptation. To address this financing gap across low-income African countries, in December of 2022, the African Development Fund, ADF, created a climate action window.
The climate action window seeks to address that gap in financing in 3 ways. What I call AAA is access. We also want to increase the availability of climate finance. And lastly is affordability.
The Climate Action Window's resources will be allocated under 3 sub-windows: adaptation, mitigation, and technical assistance. The adaptation sub-window aims to enhance resilience to climate-related shocks and strengthen the adaptive capacity of ecological, social, or economic systems or policy processes in response and support to climate change impacts. The mitigation sub-window will support projects that reduce greenhouse gas emissions or enhance the sinks that capture them, with the goal of promoting approaches that support net zero emissions. The technical assistance sub-window will assist countries to develop national climate policies and strategies, enhance the environment for climate investments, and prepare the way for investment-ready projects. The mitigation and adaptation investment sub-windows will support projects in 6 key sectors: agriculture, water security, climate information systems, transport, energy access, and green finance to achieve carbon neutral and climate resilient transformations.
For the climate action window of the African Development Fund is critical. The reason why this is critical is the issue of impact. What will it do for us? If we get that, we have 20 million farmers that will have access to climate smart agricultural technologies. We've got 20 million farmers that will have access to weather index insurance to deal with some of these exogenous extreme weather patterns that we're talking about. We'll have at least 1 million hectares of land that is degraded that we will be able to regenerate. About 9.8 million people that will have access to electricity, and over 840 million meter cubes of water that we'll be able to deliver.
Growing Africa's adaptation to climate change also has global benefits. This is exemplified by the Congo Basin, a critical line of defense in the fight against climate change due to its ability to sequester vast amounts of carbon and store it in long-term sinks. The Climate Action Window presents a giant step in setting the continent on a sustainable, climate-resilient development pathway. Let's walk that path together today.
You agree with me. this is the time for the climate action window. It's long overdue, but it's never too late. And I call on my next two speakers to take us through this. We've just had appetite really being whetted right now. So I have the pleasure of inviting Dr. James Kenyangi, who is coordinating the climate action window, to join us, and Dr. Funsho Shomori to please join us. He'll be talking about the Country Climate Adaptation Compact. So, Dr. Kenyangi, what do you have for us? We've waited for this climate action window. Yeah. Somebody said it will be announced this week. I said today. Yeah. So, tell us.
Thank you very much, Tony. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, let me take just a few minutes, I think about 2 or 3 minutes, to expand a little bit what will be available in terms of the package under the climate action window. Could you please play the PowerPoint? So the climate action window is going to be a total package. In this program cycle, which is 2023 to 2025, is going to be a total of $429 million contributed by 4 donors. That is the UK, the Netherlands, Germany, and Switzerland. Out of this amount, $258 million is going to be available under the first call for proposals. There will be a series of calls after that that will allocate the rest of the finance. But this finance is available for 37, what we call ADF countries. So these are African Development Fund countries, and these are low-income countries in Africa. Secondly, under the windows that you had in the video, there are 2 sub-windows, 2 investment sub-windows. That is the adaptation sub-window and the mitigation sub-window. Of the $322 million that's available to be allocated as 75% of the total package, $258 million will be allocated now, and the balance will be allocated later. And it will address projects that will be submitted for agriculture resilience, water security, health and sanitation, and climate information systems, and other cross-cutting areas that will be described in the guidance note that will be published on the website. $64 million will be available for mitigation, and the call for mitigation will come later on in January. The video also talked about technical assistance and the importance of technical assistance in getting projects that are ready for funding. So TA will support not just those projects that are ready for financing by supporting feasibility studies, climate risk assessments, and project preparation work, but it will also support to build the capacity of countries and institutions to develop further proposals that will attract climate finance to African countries. We are mainly looking for 4 characters in the projects that will be submitted. One, the first one is that the projects must be Paris-aligned. That means they must pass the bank's adaptation and mitigation tests and the climate safeguard screening so that they are judged to be Paris-aligned. Second, there is a series of areas that we expect the adaptation projects will respond to, including addressing climate change variability, building resilience to climate shocks, extreme events, and strengthening the adaptive capacity of ecological, social, economic, and policy processes. For mitigation projects, we expect those projects to reduce the flow of heat-trapping greenhouse gases, either by reducing the source of these gases or by abating emissions from enhancing sinks and accumulating the storage of carbon in forests, soils, oceans, and other sinks. And lastly, we expect that these projects will support cross-cutting issues. Among them will be gender, youth, and we anticipate that these projects will also serve underserved communities in fragile conditions. Lastly, we are aiming to build a robust pipeline of projects. From a whole cycle of call for proposals, we will do an eligibility assessment, we will do a selection, the programming and commitment and disbursement, which will result in a whole cycle of developing projects for financing under the climate action window. And we expect that from next year, we will have a robust pipeline of projects that will be seeking financing from the climate action window for those resources that we have mobilized now and for the resources that we are going to mobilize in future. Thank you very much. Back to you, Tony.
Thank you, James. I'm excited about this. I'm sure you'll tell us who is eligible and how much we can get down the line. Thank you again. Dr. Shomari, where are the adaptation projects? How do we find them? Through the Climate Compact, Adaptation Compact.
Thank you, moderator. Good afternoon, everyone. Could you please put on the last slide, the presentation? I think you agree with me that we've come a long way. From the years of, how many of you remember the years of National Adaptation Program of Actions, NAPAs? From the days of national communications, and then to NDCs, to NAPs, and now to LTS. It's been a long journey down here. But the key part of it, it's always a question around how does that translate into investment? What is investable? What is investment ready? So the Adaptation Country Compact is an attempt to answer that question. And what is impressive, given the partnership that we have with the Global Center on Adaptation, is that we launched this about 2 months ago, about 3 months now, in September, in Nairobi. And what we've done is basically to build on our existing program, the AAAP, that many of you know about, but more importantly, to see how do we translate all of these big ideas about what we want to do in reducing vulnerability or increase our adaptive capacity into tangible investment plans and programs that an investor can use as a basis of conversation with a country. Now, it's also important to understand and appreciate the fact that a lot of the work we've done in climate change have been mostly led by the Ministry of Environment. I'm sure that the climate change program or portfolio in your country are mostly under the Ministry of Environment. But when it comes to finance, finance is the gatekeeper of finance in most countries, in virtually all countries, is the Ministry of Finance. And we've seen over the years the disconnect between the actions in the Ministry of Environment and the financing conversation in the other ministry. So the Adaptation Compact, which is very investment-driven and very much led by the Ministry of Finance of this country, it's a way of solving that problem. So what is it about? We've been able to do 8 compacts. I won't go into the details. But basically, we're not just looking at the vulnerability, we're looking at even the progress that we have made up to date. Because if you're going to do something differently going forward, you must also understand where you've come from and perhaps the mistake we've made in the past. And then the financing needs of those countries and ultimately the instruments available and the resource mobilization strategy. So Tony mentioned we've done 8 of them, and we're going to be doing them in batches, and 7 are on the way. We have also decided to do a deep dive for a set of countries who are very particular in turning those plans into a roundtables. And these conversations around roundtable have actually started. We've had a roundtable for Senegal already, and a few days ago in Nairobi we had one for Kenya, and also for Tanzania as well. So I wanted to give you an example of Tanzania, where within this compact, we actually went back to many years to track the flow of finance, basically what our country is spending on adaptation, but also what our partners are spending on adaptation. But what is the gap that is needed to finance the adaptation component of these NDCs, but more importantly as well, to make a case. If we're going to appreciate investment in the future, we must also know and appreciate the cost of inaction, the cost of lack of investment. And these compacts have been very detailed in providing those numbers specifically to tell us. So in the case of Tanzania, how much is needed, but particularly also where would these resources come from. We went a step deeper to be able to identify, within the shortest time, what are those projects that can trigger transformative impact on the ground across different sectors that are very critical for adaptation. Resilient infrastructure, food food and security, water, energy, and the financing arrangement around it. It's the beginning of a long conversation. For those of you who are going to be interested in the window, this is a way of having a pipeline of projects, and alignment to those comparts is very critical for assessing the window that James have just talked about. And we very much look forward to working with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please, you can take your seats. Thank you. Now, we can't do it alone. We build on partnerships and we work with partners. There's absolutely no way one single institution can address Africa's climate challenges or take advantage of all its populations. A few years ago, the World Meteorological Organization published a report that said that Africa has less than 1/8 of the minimum number of stations required to support sustainable development. And so we set up the ClimDev program, Climate Information for Development in Africa, to be able to strengthen the capacities of our MET stations. But then recently, we've also partnered with the Systematic Observation Financing Facility that has been put up to help strengthen our observation systems. And I welcome Dr. Marcos Repnik to please come to the front. And then, while he's up there, I also welcome, no, you won't be able to see the video from there. Maybe please, please, can we have the soft video? Forgot that they'll be backing. To show you the sort of things that we're doing, the African Development Bank is leading in supporting 9 of the African countries that are benefiting from the Systematic Observation Financing Facility. Soft, please.
Already creating havoc, especially in the vulnerable. Climate change is already creating havoc, especially in the vulnerable regions, where every minute and every action count. SOF, the Systematic Observations Financing Facility, is the cornerstone for climate change adaptation, with a focus on developing a sustainable observational network. Observations are a critical component in the weather information value chain, supporting informed weather and climate-based decisions. In South Sudan, SOF is bringing together the National Weather Service, a peer advisor, and an implementing entity to make sustained weather observations a long-term reality. South Sudan
society and economy are continually suffering from weather and climate disasters. Preferred meteorological service with solid observational capacity is vital to contribute towards mitigating of impact of weather and climate induced disasters, therefore contributing towards saving life and property. The South Sudan Meteorological Service needs to upgrade its weather observational capacity to generate adequate data and information that could meet the increasing needs of these decision makers and assist the society facing disasters. We thank SOFT international community, peer advisor, and implementing entity for coming on time to work with us in these challenging moments. Thank you for listening.
Sharing expertise to support the global meteorological community is an important part of Geosphere Austria's core mission. Austria has supported the SOF initiative since its inception. We are happy to accompany several national meteorological services as peer advisor in their journey towards the compliance to international standards like GBON. which we believe is integral to the value chain of weather and climate services. We are delighted that the South Sudanese Meteorological Service is the first that we will be supporting in the implementation of SOF. We are sure this joint effort will contribute to the South Sudanese society in the short and long terms.
Hello everyone, my name is James Kinyangi. I am the coordinator of the Climate and Development Special Fund for Africa at the African Development Bank and also the focal point for SOF. The journey has only begun, and in the years to come, with the joint effort under the SOF umbrella, the African Development Bank, together with Geosphere Austria, together with FAO, CRUISE, and other international key players, and above all, through the strong commitment and engagement of the South Sudan Meteorological Service, a sustained network of GBON-compliant stations will initiate South Sudan's path to provide essential and reliable weather and climate services, especially those dedicated to early warnings for emergency preparedness and early action. Thank you.
Thank you. Apologize for the low video quality. But what we have seen is that there's a lot that needs to be done. Africa would benefit from strengthened weather observation systems. And so I have the pleasure of welcoming to the podium, to the floor, Mr. Marcus Repnik, who is the WMO SOF Secretariat Director. Thank you very much. You've been the brain behind this. Maybe tell us, why should Africa be a part of SOF?
What a pleasure to be here again with you, to be among friends, Tony, James, and others. To be on the journey that we just started, to Tony, as you mentioned, to change Africa's narrative. On one important point that you, Mr. Vice President, mentioned, you were emphasizing the importance to focus on data and of evidence. Now, I have bad news because actually, Tony, what you're referring to, that Africa's coverage of basic weather and climate observation data were only 1/8. Actually, as of today, Africa, all African countries, comply with only 9% or deliver only 9% of the international agreed basic weather and climate observation data. And this is not a nice to have, this is a must have, and it's an international obligation. Since January this year, all countries must generate this basic weather and climate data to underpin the trillions of dollars of investments needed for effective use of investments. So SOF, the Systematic Observations Financing Facility, also reflects what I think it was you, Tony, talking about, or Mr. Vice President, you were talking about old thinking, about going out of the vicious circle. So how do we operate? You got a glimpse on South Sudan. A, we provide to African countries long-term, open-ended, grant-only finance to generate the internationally agreed basic weather and climate data. Beyond projects. This is not a project. This is a commitment. This is a partnership with African countries, with the Met offices of these African countries. We promise long-term, open-ended grant finance. Think about Red Plus for meteorology. On an annual basis, a check back to countries that deliver on their commitment. Second, it's not only about money, it's about technical assistance. We're showcasing the example of South Sudan. In this case, the Austrian Met Service is working with the South Sudan Met Service. Each country is going to getting a peer. For example, the South African Weather Service is now partnering with Mozambique. We have the Nigerian Met Office partnering with a few countries. So also here, long-term technical assistance by those who know what it takes to run an observing system, not international consultants flying in and out. And by the way, the technical assistance provided by these Met officers on a non-profit basis. So first, long-term open-ended finance, changing the narrative, going out of the debt crisis. Because the data that Africa is generating are crucially important for Africa, but they're equally important for the country where we're here, or in every other country. Because for every weather forecast beyond 3 days, let alone for every climate projection, we need data from across the globe. And we have today major data gaps in Africa. So first, different way of financing. Second, different way of providing technical assistance. Long-term, open-ended technical assistance from those who know how to run an observing system. And third, this brings me actually to the conversation today, working with partners to leverage financial resources, to bring together soft resources with resources from bilateral partners. I'm happy to have here our dear colleagues Peter from the Netherlands as a partner, for example, on South Sudan. But in particular, bringing the resources from the African Development Bank to the table, including to the climate action window that you were just launching. South Sudan is a great example. We come in with $2.5 million to fix part, to support the country fixing part of the basic weather climate observation gap. African Development Bank is coming in with substantially more resources to take advantage and support the country in making use of this data. So to summarize, I see a huge opportunity for Africa to turn the tide. Today, already 24 African countries are benefiting from SOF. And these 24 African countries benefiting from SOF would close exactly half of today's massive data gap, namely only 9% of coverage. But data alone is not sufficient. Data need to be transformed into investments, into actions, and that's the reason why we are so pleased partnering with the African Development Bank as an implementing entity of SOF, an implementing entity of SOF that actually brings in additional resources, including through this climate action window. Sincere thanks to the excellent collaboration with you, Tony, James, and your team. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We're doing well on time. I now have the pleasure of inviting Mr. Peter Copper, the team lead on climate adaptation at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. Please, you can take a seat. Then I also like to invite to the podium Ms. Nolala Zindela, who is the Deputy Director and Head of Programming Division, the Division of Country Programming at the Green Climate Fund. Is she around? Yes, thank you very much. Very important partner. Sir, you have the floor. And when you have the floor, you should be able to tell us what the government of Netherlands is doing to support adaptation on the African continent. You can come to the front.
Thank you, Tony, and thank you for having me here. And I want to express my gratitude to the AfDB for putting this session together, but also really for the leadership, Tony, that you and your team have put together with the president of the African Development Bank, for putting together the most ambitious adaptation program that I have seen, that we have seen, which is the AAAP, the Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program. Africa-owned, African-led. So I think, you know, as a donor, as a supporter, we very much encourage this kind of large-scale thinking. And I want to express my gratitude for the leadership, together with this GCA that you're doing on that. As the Netherlands, we are putting 100 million into the climate action window, supporting the AAAP. So we are amongst the first movers. We are amongst the biggest donors to this program. And for us, really, Africa is our focus country. Marcus just spoke about SOF. We are the biggest investor in SOF. We're putting 15 million. So really, it's about connecting the dots. It's making sure that these different initiatives which land in Africa are supported and have the African ownership to it. And I also want to express my gratitude to the African countries, because oftentimes we're on stage because we're providing funding, but actually a lot of the funding is coming from your national budgets. And it's also coming from, the African citizens that are also paying for the loss of harvest and the expenses that come out of the climate change. So it's not just countries like myself that should take the stage. I think I would very much encourage more African countries, more countries that are actually implementing the funding that we are providing for the programs. And I just want to express my full support. As the Netherlands, we are providing now $1.4 billion annually to climate finance. Half of that public funding that we provide is for adaptation. It's more than half even. And we're increasing the total amount to 1.8 by 2025. So really pushing for the doubling of adaptation finance, making sure that we deliver on that commitment, and we need African countries particularly keeping on pressing for that target. So I just want to express my support for this program, and we are very, very much looking forward to supporting you further. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much for that support. Netherlands has been a very strong supporter of the African Development Bank, and I thank you. Zindela? Yes, the Green Climate Fund. You are our fund. So what can you tell us about how you strengthen adaptation in Africa? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tony, for calling us in on this. And greetings, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure for me to represent GCF at this important discussion. And just to start off to say we really support the climate action window, and we look forward to defining with the African Development Bank in concrete terms what this would look like. I just want to highlight that going into what we call the second programming cycle of GCF, GCF2, the donor community has been very supportive. We've received very strong pledges which enable us to continue our support to countries. A lot has been said about weak capacities in terms of defining climate investments, and I really want to highlight the role of our readiness support program, which is grant financing. In the previous years, we used to provide 1 million per country per year, but we are now in this new cycle, 2024 to 2027, looking at lifting the cap, and the board has approved that so that countries can be given 4 million for the cycle, and they can take a long-term perspective, focusing on capacity building as well as developing a pipeline of bankable projects. And to do so, our priority is working with national direct and regional direct access entities. What I want to reflect on is that Africa has 25 direct access entities, and 25 is not a good number for a continent this large. And of that 25, only 11 are programming with GCF. So in this case, it calls on us in the continent to do a lot of work to raise quality institutions and to promote them to get accredited with GCF, because there is a gap, and the least developed countries, most of which are in Africa, are a priority programming area for GCF. So I wouldn't want Tony to stand up, but just to highlight that GCF is your institution. We are here to work and collaborate with the African Development Bank, but our focus, besides just this climate action window that is announced today, we are here to stay. And as we get into the second decade of the existence of the GCF, we really want to zero and deepen our collaboration with the continent. And with that, we'll do more work offline. Thank you, Tony.
Thank you very much. There's opportunities for Africa. Only 25 countries have direct access entities. That's not good enough. And only 11 actually have submitted proposals. I think that gives me a lot of work and my colleagues. So thank you so very much. And I am glad that we're all here now. And you will be glad that you were there when history was being made, when the climate action window was launched. So right now, I have the privilege of inviting my boss, the Vice President for Power, Energy, Climate Change and Green Growth at the African Development Bank, Dr. Kevin Kairuki, to come give his remarks. You're welcome, sir. And I will stand for you.
Thank you very much, Tony. Ladies and gentlemen and colleagues, when I was watching the video on the impacts of climate change, I couldn't help thinking that this is only because of 1.1 degrees Celsius rise in temperature above pre-industrial period. I always wonder, what would it look like if it was 1.5 or indeed 3 as it's being projected by end of this century? I think the circumstances would be more or less what you describe to be of apocalyptic tendencies. But having said that, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, firstly, I would like to thank all the speakers for their excellent interventions. Additionally, I would like to really thank and especially commend the UK, the Netherlands, Germany, and Switzerland for believing in our dream of a climate action window and complementing their belief with generous contributions of an aggregate sum of $429 million, thus validating the proof of concept. We cannot thank them enough. And since last year, today, we have approved guidelines required to operationalize the climate action window. However, and for those who know our boss, we are called to be ambitious all the time. Our target is $4 billion. Our medium target is $4 billion by 2025. We therefore invite other donors to contribute to this window in order to help us bridge the current projected annual climate finance deficit of about $250 billion a year through 2030 by providing a dedicated, this is very important, a dedicated accessible and efficient source of affordable climate finance for the 37 countries that James Kinyanggi talked about, who are most vulnerable and least adaptive to climate change. And I believe, again, showing ambition here, this creates a good foundation towards the longer-term target of $13 billion. In this regard, we will shortly be embarking on a concerted fundraising campaign targeted at state actors, and for the first time, non-state actors, such as private sector and philanthropic foundations that are looking for a platform through which they can channel their climate finance to meet climate finance commitments, including the now maybe famous or infamous $100 billion for developing countries, towards the doubling of adaptation finance by 2025, and of course, possibly the pursuit of parity between mitigation and adaptation finance. This, in my view, will increase your banks, the AfDB's, what I would call firepower, to be able to support our regional member countries' efforts against climate action and strengthen their ability to adapt and mitigate to the impact of climate change. But as what somebody once said here earlier, it is one thing to have the resources, but people keep on asking, where do you apply these resources? So what this means is that we must find and provide a mechanism for deploying the resources that will be realized. And what this does, it leads us to the significant milestone that we are celebrating today. This is the launch of the first call for proposals that will enable eligible countries and project developers to formally submit adaptation proposals. Applications can be made online with effect from today up to the 4th, that is the 4th of December, and close on the 2nd of February 2024. The first batch of successful projects are expected to be announced in April 2024. And what this means is that what we are trying to do with the climate action window, we want to be different. We want to be nimble. We want to be able to be responsive to the requirements of our regional member countries. Moreover, and this was mentioned earlier, you will be most pleased to note that to help alleviate the risk of what I'm sure my namesake Prof must have mentioned, the risk of debt distress, the climate action window resources will be largely feature grants and highly concessional loans, which can in turn be blended with proceeds from the loss and damage fund. And I think you've all heard the amounts of loss and damage funds that various countries are promising to provide. After this, as I said, this will be for purposes of adaptation. We will shortly follow with a call for proposals for mitigation projects. Finally, on behalf of the African Development Bank Group, the African Development Fund, and indeed the beneficiary countries to the climate action window, I thank you all for gracing this landmark occasion, marking the first call for proposals for the climate action window, and therefore operationalizing the climate action window. I think on that note, I will thank you, and I think we'll now go to what you've all been looking for. We will not count, we will not make you guess, but we will make sure that we launch the climate action window that will enable our countries, give them some little bit of firepower to be able to mitigate the impacts of climate change. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, and I invite the team to please take us to access the climate action window. This will basically let you see that it's live, and after that, the Vice President will declare formally launched. I know some people told me they will have their projects in their back pocket, that the moment the announcement is done, they will be the first to submit. And so we look forward to having people here submit and reminding me that actually we were together at COP when it was launched. I was there. And I think that could give you some concession if you can actually prove that you were here with us at the beginning. Yes? Can you please? Okay. Maybe you want to.
Tony and VP for launching the first call for proposals. I'm sure we are all relieved, the team working behind the scenes. So I'll just quickly take you through this demo. You might be wondering, how do you now access the call for proposal on adaptation? So you simply have to go to this link, which will be publicly made available. It is now live. As VP said, the launch date is between December 4, 2023, with a closing date of February 2nd, 2024. When you get to this link, you will see this landing page. You basically have to choose the language of your choice, in English or French, before you begin your application. You'll be required to create an account. So please, when you get to the site, one of the most important things we want you to take a moment to do is to thoroughly read this guidance note and frequently asked questions. We urge you to do that because it will answer a lot of the questions you may have regarding the call for proposal. After creating an account, you receive a notification. Immediately, you would be able to go click on complete this questionnaire. After doing so, it will take you about 45 minutes to an hour if you have all the required information. Again, go back frequently to your guidance notes and frequently asked questions to consult, to answer most of the questions you may have about the call. The eligibility or not of your institution really depends on how thoroughly you review this first phase of completing this questionnaire. Once you have completed, you can click submit, and immediately, if you are eligible, if your institution is eligible, you'll be able to access the project concept note template to be able to download, complete, and upload by clicking on the start button. All right, when you come here, you download your concept note, and then after downloading, make sure it's on your computer and mark as complete. Upload your concept note with any annexes or attachments you may deem relevant, and then once done, mark complete, also indicated here. Then finally, you select submit, and you receive an email notification right away that the COW Secretariat has received your concept note. Kindly note this, everything you need to complete this call for proposal is on the site. So please do not send us a concept note template different from what is available on this SM Apply site. Finally, we will use the email address. You will use the email address you used to create the account throughout the entire process. So please make sure if you're working with colleagues that this is accessible to them. And then I'm excited to say we wish you all the very best with your applications, and the COW Secretariat looks forward to receiving them. Thank you.
So I think just in case anybody wonders why we are focusing on adaptation in the first instance, we all know that Africa's climate change is locked in for the next 20 years. So even if we do not emit 1 additional ton of CO2, our fate is sealed as far as adverse and the frequency of events are concerned. So that's why we believe that Africa's primary focus is on adaptation, and that's why we have started with adaptation. So I think in recognition of this increasing frequency and severity of extreme weather events and their impacts to the economies and societies of the most vulnerable and fragile countries and economies in Africa, I now have the pleasure to, and on behalf of the African Development Fund and its beneficiary countries, to launch this call for proposals for adaptation projects that will deliver transformational climate outcomes. All eligible entities will be expected to file their proposals, applications by the closing date of 2nd February 2024. Please do not say you are not warned. You've all heard it loud and clear. You've been shown how to apply. I do believe that you are all internet ready or internet compliant. Therefore, I think on this note, I say it's now my honor and indeed privilege to declare the call for proposals officially open. Thank you very much, and you are welcome for coffee and snacks outside here. And just to add something extra for all of you, the team is under instruction to make sure that we leverage these resources 3 or 4 times. So we will have more resources than just the $322 million that you've seen there. All the very best. Welcome for coffee and snacks. Thank you.
So thank you. And that's closed.